The American idea. It's a huge concept, right? It was born out of a revolution, got tested by a massive expansion, was completely reforged in a civil war, and you could argue it's still being fought over today. So we're going to trace that whole story from the very beginning all the way to its, well, very unfinished present. But first, I want you to keep one question in your head through all of this. How is a nation's story actually told? I mean, who gets to write it? Is it this one, straight line from A to B? Or is it more like a constant argument, a debate over what the nation really is, what it was, and what it ought to be? Honestly, that question, it's the key to understanding the entire American story. Because here's the thing. The story of a place almost always begins long before the name we know it by today. And the story of America? It's no different. It starts way, way before the beginning. So, let's start in a world before the United States was even a glimmer in someone's eye. And this is so crucial because to get what comes next, you have to remember one fundamental truth. The land that would become this new nation was never, ever empty. It was a continent just bustling with people and thousands of years of history. And just look at the scale of what was already here. We're not talking about small tribes wandering around. We're talking about vast, complex civilizations. I mean, take the Mississippian culture. For hundreds of years, they built cities. They had trade networks that spanned the continent, and they engineered these massive earthworks. Their capital, a city we call Cahokia, was a thriving metropolis. Get this, it was larger than London was at the exact same time. This wasn't a wilderness. It was a homeland. Okay, now let's fast forward. Into this world of ancient homelands and global empires, a new and, frankly, radical idea is about to explode onto the scene. It's this attempt to build a nation not on ancestry, not on the divine right of kings, but on a set of principles written down on paper.
And here it is, that moment of rupture. In 1776, this declaration comes out. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just a list of complaints against King George. No, this was a formal, public, we're done. A severing of political ties. This was the birth certificate of a new nation, and it was founded on the wild idea of self-governance.
So what was the philosophical engine driving this whole thing? Well, it was the concept of natural rights. This idea, which was heavily borrowed from thinkers like John Locke, basically says that some rights are just inherent. They're not granted to you by a government, which means a government can't take them away. That was the core justification Thomas Jefferson wove right into the fabric of the Declaration. So, these big ideas were then locked into 3 core documents, what we call the Charters of Freedom. You can kind of think of it like this. The Declaration of Independence, that's the why. It's the mission statement. The Constitution, that's the how. It's the blueprint, the nuts and bolts of the government. And the Bill of Rights, that's the you can't do this list for the government, defining the rights of the people. Together, they're the philosophical bedrock of the whole country. But you know, an idea on paper is one thing. Actually putting it into practice across a massive continent, that's something else entirely. And this brings us to the 19th century, and this big, thorny question of how a self-proclaimed empire of liberty would handle the temptations of, well, empire. The driving force behind all this expansion had a name: manifest destiny. It was this incredibly powerful, almost religious belief that American expansion westward wasn't just a good idea, it was inevitable. It was divinely ordained. I mean, the name says it all. It was their manifest or obvious destiny. And this just perfectly illustrates the core conflict of the time. On the one hand, a lot of people saw it as this noble mission, a chance to spread democracy and the American way of life. But on the other hand, critics back then, and certainly now, saw it as a pretty convenient mask for something a lot uglier. A justification for land grabs, for racial superiority, and for just aggressive self-interest. And the consequences of this belief were monumental, and they were often brutal. It led right to the annexation of Texas as a slave state. It fueled the Mexican-American War, a war that future President Ulysses S. Grant would later call one of the most unjust he'd ever seen. Most profoundly, it resulted in the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral homes. And with every single new mile of territory, it just poured more fuel on the fire of the nation's biggest, most divisive question. Is this going to be an empire of liberty or an empire of slavery?
Well, that fire eventually just consumed the entire nation in the Civil War. And in its aftermath came this period called Reconstruction. It's one of the most critical and honestly most contested periods in all of American history. It was this brief, really fraught window of opportunity to truly remake the nation and maybe, just maybe, finally live up to those founding ideals.
And what happened next was just this whirlwind of incredible progress and horrifying backlash. I mean, in just 5 years, you get 3 constitutional amendments that completely redefine American citizenship. But the backlash was just as fast. The Ku Klux Klan was formed to terrorize and intimidate, and then by 1877, a shady backroom political deal leads to federal troops being pulled out of the South, which effectively just slams the door shut on the entire project of Reconstruction. So the takeaway here is absolutely crucial. Reconstruction succeeded in writing equality into the Constitution. It created a legal framework that would become incredibly important down the road. But, and this is a huge but, it failed to protect those rights on the ground. Its collapse allowed for the rise of Jim Crow, a whole system of state-sponsored racial segregation, and it left its most important work tragically unfinished. So after Reconstruction, the nation just barrels into this period of explosive growth. Kind of like the promises of the era, this new prosperity had a really dark underside. Welcome to the Gilded Age. You gotta love the name. It was coined by Mark Twain, and he was being completely sarcastic. It wasn't a golden age, it was gilded, meaning it had this thin, glittering layer of gold on the surface, but underneath it was hiding much cheaper, much uglier material. And that just perfectly captures the paradox of the late 19th century. And man, what a paradox it was. On the one hand, this was the age of incredible invention. Skyscrapers, electric lights, phonographs, and real wages for a lot of workers did actually grow. But at the exact same time, poverty was rampant. Immigrants were crowded into these unsanitary tenements. Immense fortunes were being concentrated in the hands of just a tiny few. And all the while, the South was still economically shattered. And for African Americans, this was the beginning of the long, dark night of Jim Crow. So after decades of industrialization, a couple of world wars, and massive economic turmoil, it would take another century for the country to really, truly confront the unfinished work of Reconstruction. And this brings us to the Civil Rights Movement, this renewed, nationwide struggle that's often called the Second American Revolution. It was a fight to finally make the nation's promises real for all its citizens. The pace of change during this period was just breathtaking. It kicks off with the landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And that's followed by this wave of nonviolent protests, bus boycotts, sit-ins, massive marches. All of this activism builds and builds until it culminates in a series of monumental laws that dismantle the entire legal structure of segregation in just a few short, incredible years. And at the heart of this movement was this powerful appeal looking all the way back to the nation's founding documents. At the March on Washington in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech wasn't just a dream, it was a demand. It was a demand that America finally live up to the promise of its own creed. It was a vision of the society he hoped his own children could live in. So in essence, the civil rights movement picked up the baton that was dropped when Reconstruction ended. It achieved in law, through protest and pressure, what had been promised 100 years earlier. Now, it didn't solve every problem, not by a long shot, but it fundamentally transformed American society, and it issued this permanent challenge for the nation to be true to its own ideals. Which brings us right back to our original question. A nation's story isn't some static object sitting in a museum. It's a living, breathing, and often contentious argument. From the complex societies that were here long before 1776, to the contradictions of expansion and the long, long fight for civil rights, the American story has always been a continuous struggle over the meaning of its own founding idea. So the real question for us now is, what does its next chapter hold?